All right, so why don't we get started? Good afternoon. My name is Philip Bloom. I'm the June and Simon Casey Lee Curator of the Chinese Garden at the Huntington, where I also direct our Center for East Asian Garden Studies. And today it's my very great pleasure to welcome everyone to the final talk in our Spring 2021 lecture series, Crafting a Literati Paradise in 19th Century Japan, the Plum Blossom Valley at Tsukigase, presented by Dr. Yuriko Wakamatsu. Dr. Wakamatsu is Assistant Professor of East Asian Art History at Occidental College here in Los Angeles, and I've had the great privilege of knowing her since we both were graduate students at Harvard University, where she received her PhD in 2016. Dr. Wakamatsu is a specialist in literati art, the combined practice of painting, poetry, and calligraphy, particularly of Japan's Meiji period, and her work focuses especially on women artists. In essence, Dr. Wakamatsu studies artists and artworks that are at least triply removed from conventional conceptions of literati art. Many of you likely know that literati art originated in China, and it's sometimes assumed to be distinctly Chinese, but it was also widely practiced in Japan, where it gained distinctive new forms of expression. Literati art is frequently characterized as having reached its heights in 14th or 17th century China, depending on whom you ask, but it probably found its greatest and most democratic popularity in the 19th century in Japan. And literati art is often unthinkingly assumed to have been the exclusive domain of men, but Japanese women embraced it as a mode of artistic production that enabled them to thrive as independent artists. Through her research on such artworks, Dr. Wakamatsu really is reshaping the ways that art historians think about literati art. And she's doing so through the sorts of close, joyful analysis of art objects themselves that many art historians have recently forgone. Her scholarship truly is a pleasure to read, and her most recent article, Imagined Selves, Mediating Desires and Subject Positions in the Japanese Literati Art of Okuhara Seiko, appeared in the latest issue of Archives of Asian Art. I'd highly recommend it to everyone, both for its innovative discussion of the ways that a literati artwork not only expresses something of the artist's self, which is something that all literati art ostensibly does, but also because Professor Wakamatsu proposes an innovative way of reading the various identities for the artist and the viewer that are imaginatively proposed by the artwork. Perhaps more important than Dr. Wakamatsu's research, however, is her commitment to teaching. Each semester, I have the great pleasure of meeting with her and her students in the Huntington's Asian Gardens, and I'm able to see firsthand the incredible energy and erudition that she shares with her students. By approaching each student as an individual and by encouraging their curiosity, criticality, and empathy, Dr. Wakamatsu not only instills in her students a love of East Asian art and garden history, but she also inspires them to become better, more conscientious, more engaged people themselves. The opportunity to see such a remarkable instructor and such enthusiastic students in action is, for me, the highlight of every fall and spring. Today, Dr. Wakamatsu will discuss a painting of Tsukigase, a plum-filled paradise in Western Japan, by the 19th century artist Okuhara Seiko. The painting and its inscriptions draw extensively on Chinese precedents, transforming the work into something that mediates between the real-world geography of Japan and visions of imagined Chinese places that were actually internalized by Japanese literati. This examination of the interplay between Chinese and Japanese cultural expressions and between physical places and imagined ideals, I think, shares quite a lot with the fundamental projects of the Huntington's Asian Gardens. And in the years ahead, I really hope we'll increasingly learn from the work of Dr. Wakamatsu and her peers as we think about how to interpret the Chinese and Japanese gardens in meaningful relation to one another. The new art gallery in the Chinese garden, which will open on August 28th, and the Japanese Heritage House project furnish significant platforms through which to begin this important work. So throughout today's talk, please feel free to enter any questions or comments you have by clicking on the Q&A box that appears at the bottom or top of your screen, depending on your device. I'll pose your questions to Dr. Wakamatsu after her talk. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Yurika Wakamatsu to discuss crafting a literati paradise in 19th century Japan, the Plum Blossom Valley at Tsukigase.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bloom, for the kind introduction and for inviting me to speak. I also thank Michelle Bailey and Ben Tuttle for their help in making this event possible. And thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. I'm very grateful for this opportunity to discuss my research with you, and I really look forward to your questions and comments. In times of instability or dramatic change, many of us may find solace by imagining alternative worlds where life without worries may be possible. Such universal yearnings for peace and happiness have given rise to a vast body of utopian literature and imagery. In East Asia, paradisal lands have often been imagined to be very far away, separated from the mundane world by high mountains or vast seas. The immortal island of Panglai, for example, was thought to be located to the far east. On this magical island, wine glasses were imagined to refill themselves, while fruits growing on jewel trees could heal any ailment. On the mythical Mount Kunlun, said to be found in the far west, immortals flew among towering cliffs of jasper and jade. These divine persons were believed to suck the wind, drink the dew, and wander beyond the seas on clouds, birds, and dragons. Such vivid descriptions of transcendence inspired some people to seek to commune with these immortals and to join in their eternal existences. One of the most zealous such seekers was Emperor Wu of the Han Dynasty, who ruled China during the 2nd century BCE. Wishing to obtain an elixir of life, he sent envoys to search for Panglai. He also tried to summon the spirits to his palace. Believing that immortals like to live in towers, he constructed terrace buildings of unusual height in the hope that the spirits would be enticed to dwell in them. To the emperor's dismay, however, his efforts to find immortal lands and to attract their spirits failed. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the East Asian search for paradise is often tinged with melancholic ambivalence. We may hope to reach paradisal lands, but they inevitably slip beyond our reach. Yet, in 19th century Japan, practitioners of literati art, a combination of painting, poetry, and calligraphy, discovered a real-world paradise. In the plum-filled valley of Tsukigase, high in the mountains of what is now Nara Prefecture, they found the sort of immortal landscape that their Chinese forebears had sought. By physically traveling to this site and by depicting it in text and image using conventions drawn from Semitic traditions of utopic thought, they transformed Tsukigase into a paradisal space, as real as it was imagined. In the next 45 minutes, we will explore Tsukigase and its mediation of physical landscape and the utopian dreams by looking closely at this hand scroll, Plum Blossoms in Tsukigase Valley, which was produced by the Japanese artist Okuhara Seiko in 1896. Combining painting, prose, and poetry, Seiko's scroll immerses its viewers in the sensory pleasures of a paradise on earth. Okuhara Seiko was born in 1837 as the fourth daughter of a high-ranking retainer in the Koga domain, today's Ibaraki Prefecture. In 1865, Seiko left her family home for Edo, which soon became Tokyo, to pursue a career as a professional painter. Seiko specialized in literati art, a combined practice of painting, poetry, and calligraphy first formulated by scholar officials in 11th century China. In Japan, literati art rose to great popularity in the mid-19th century. Seiko was a central figure in this literati art boom, becoming widely known for exuberant ink paintings and a willfully distorted style of calligraphy. Simultaneously, Seiko cropped her hair and dressed in men's kimono, despite new government ordinances that prohibited cross-dressing and women's sporting short hair. In 1891, after spending more than 2 decades working as an artist and educator in the capital, Seiko left the metropolitan art world to retire to rural Kamikawakami in Kumagaya City, Saitama Prefecture. There, Seiko continued to paint for patrons while traveling throughout the archipelago. Seiko's plum blossoms in Tsukigase Valley offers an ideal case study to examine how an actual physical site was turned into a paradisal place in the literary imagination of 19th century Japan. To make sense of this site and the scroll, we will first gain a sense of Tsukigase by briefly surveying Seiko's painting. We will then explore the history of this mountain valley, looking specifically at how the site came to be filled with flowering plum trees, Prunas mume, which are known as ume in Japanese. We will then investigate how this remote hidden site was discovered and popularized by literary travelers in the mid-19th century. Next, we will analyze the ways in which Seiko's painting incorporates themes from earlier utopian imagery to visualize the valley. Finally, we will examine the relationship between the painting and the accompanying inscriptions. We will say that the inscribed poems evoke the bodily sensation of wandering through Tsukigase, immersing the beholder in the sights, sounds, and scents of the site. Ultimately, this talk will show that Seiko's work engages with utopian literature and imagery to envision Tsukigase as a paradisal realm and to enable the viewer to travel through it. Through Seiko's skillful interweaving of painting and poetry, this paradise is made immediately accessible and viscerally inhabitable. The work thus invites the beholder not only to view, but also to feel, sense, and experience the pictured wonderland. So let's begin with a quick look at Seiko's scroll to immerse ourselves in this immortal realm. The hand scroll is about 11 inches high and a little over 16 feet long. A round roller is attached to the left. A wooden stave is attached to the right to keep the scroll stretched. You unroll the scroll a bit at a time from the roller and transfer the excess to the right. Only about 1 arm's length is exposed at a time. You view the painting and read the text inscribed on it from right to left. The hand scroll format allows you to physically move the object and control the pace of viewing. It's literally a moving picture. Plum blossoms in Tsukigase Valley presents a continuous landscape painting that extends laterally, parallel to the picture plane. Seiko fills the negative space of the hand scroll with dense calligraphic inscriptions. The text begins with a preface, followed by a series of 15 Sinitic poems, most of which seem to have been composed by Seiko. A postscript is included at the end. Seiko's scroll combines image and text to take the viewer on an imaginary journey through the plum-filled mountainscape. The painting begins with a mountainside depicted in the foreground that creates a steep slope from the upper right to the lower left. Following this downward slope, we viewers immediately dive into the bottom of the valley to emerge on a path that appears in the middle ground. The path climbs up a hill and opens onto a plain where houses can be found. These clusters of houses are nestled among trees, providing us with a sense of discovery. a sense that we as travelers have stumbled upon a remote, secluded village. As we move forward, the plum blossoms become ever denser. Among the flowering trees, a narrow path zigzags up toward a ridge. Suddenly, a dramatic cliff comes into view. Beneath the cliff, a river surges around colorful rocks. The water emerges from the depths of the landscape and flows into the foreground before continuing horizontally to the left, facilitating the viewer's lateral movement. Crossing the river, we witness a vast profusion of plum blossoms turning into clouds. These nebulous white clouds contrast with the lapidary blue and green boulders that arise along the riverbank. High mountains create a wall in the middle ground and seal off the vista to enfold us in the scene. We get the sense that we are navigating through a narrow valley. Eventually, we come to the end of the valley, where the colors of the landscape fade away and disappear. The site that Seiko depicts is identified in the inscriptions on the hand scroll as Tsukigase. Tsukigase refers to a constellation of 10 villages located at the northeastern edge of today's Nara Prefecture in Western Japan. Tsukigase or Tsukise was the name of one of these villages, but this name came to refer to the entire region. Throughout this talk, I will use the name Tsukigase to refer to the whole region that encompassed these 10 villages. Situated to the north of the Yamato Highlands, Tsukigase lies near the borders of 3 prefectures, Nara in the south, Mie in the east, and Kyoto in the north. The Nabari River, also known as the Satsuki River, flows from southeast to northwest, forming a deep V-shaped valley. Covering the hillsides are numerous flowering plum trees. The origins of the planting of plum trees in Tsukigase are obscure, but it is said that by the 15th century, this valley was filled with flowering plums. The limited arable land of this deep mountain valley prevented villagers from growing rice, which was the primary means through which taxes were paid during the early modern period. However, the area's topography and climate were fit for cultivating flowering plum trees, one of the most cherished plants in East Asia. As many of you might know, the Huntington's Chinese and Japanese gardens have several varieties of flowering plum. You can see white, pink, and red plum blossoms in the gardens from late December to early February. Until the modern period, however, people in Tsukigase did not plant flowering plum trees for their blossoms. Instead, they cultivated them for their fruits, which were used to make ubai, smoked and dried plums employed as a mordant to set safflower dyes on kimono fabrics. To make ubai, the fruits are gathered in summer, washed and covered in soot. The soot-covered plums are arranged on bamboo screens. They are then smoked over a fire for 24 hours. After smoking, the fruits are dried in the sun for a month, losing 4/5 of their weight. These smoked and dried plums were then transported to Kyoto, where they were used as a color-fixing mordant in safflower dyeing. During the dyeing process, ubai was dissolved in water with dried and fermented safflower paddies. The acidic ubai helped set the safflower dyes on fabrics. Production of ubai in Tsukigase increased in the late 18th century, paralleling an increase in the production of safflower paddies in northern Japan. At the peak of the demand for ubai in the early 19th century, it is said that nearly 100,000 plum trees covered the region. Thanks to the numerous plum trees, the view of Tsukigase in early spring was spectacular. But this mountain valley was situated in a remote, secluded location. How was this isolated valley found by travelers? How did Tsukigase become a must-see site in Western Japan? The Confucian scholar Saito Setsudo is credited with popularizing Tsukigase as a hidden haven. Setsudo visited Tsukigase in 1830 and left a detailed account of his travels. Other travelers had visited the site before Setsudo and had written about their journeys in prose and poetry, but it was Setsudo's account that made the site known as a plum-filled valley of otherworldly beauty. Setsudo's essay intimately conveys the author's emotions during his eventful journey. It begins by celebrating the uniqueness of Tsukigase as a site where one can appreciate both plum blossoms and the scenic landscape. But because of its remoteness, visitors are rare. Setsudo notes that he had long wanted to admire plum blossoms in Tsukigase under a full moon. After spending several years contemplating on the best time to visit, he finally decided to travel to the valley with his friends in the middle of the second month of 1830. When they approached the valley, Setsudo and his companions were ecstatic to find plum flowers in nearly full bloom. They arrived at an inn and patiently waited for the moon to rise. However, after sunset, dark clouds began to spread across the sky. Unable to see the moon, the despondent travelers decided to drink to brighten their feelings. Suddenly, an attendant rushed in to report that the clouds had broken and the moon had come out. Setsudo and his company threw away their sake cups and ran outside. They first wandered through the grove of plum trees, finding moonlit blossoms like luminous pearls. They then drifted on the river in a boat, seeing the reflection of the moon shimmering on the water like silver scales. Setsudo's account goes on to describe how they savored the unworldly sights of Tsukigase before reluctantly returning home. From this account, it is clear that the numerous plum blossoms that adorned the mountain valley captivated Literati travelers like Saito Setsudo. What made the flowering plums so attractive to them? Setsudo and contemporary poets and painters cherished the flowering plum because of its high status in Sinitic Literati culture. Blooming in small, subtly fragrant blossoms on slender leafless branches, plum had been celebrated in China as a symbol of purity and refinement since the 11th century. Flowering plum blooms in early spring when other plants remain dormant. Its ability to endure the cold season, to send out young shoots from old boughs, and to blossom despite snow and ice made the plant a symbol of endurance and regeneration. In fact, plum is regarded as one of the three friends of the cold season, along with pine and bamboo. Withstanding the hardship of winter, this triad of wintry companions came to embody Confucian moral ideals of integrity and uprightness. Setsudo specifically mentions that the botanical tapestry that covers the cliff of Tsukigase is woven from these three friends. Further, the flowering plum came to be identified with eremitic ideals. Plum's plain white flowers signify the recluse's pure, secluded life, the subtle fragrance, the recluse's humility, and its solitary flowering, the recluse's resolute isolation. It was plum's symbolic embodiment of these ideals that enchanted Literati travelers when wandering the plum-filled valley at Tsukigase. Setsudo's vivid travel account seems to have circulated privately in manuscript form before it was finally published as a printed book in 1852. The scenic beauty of Tsukigase consists of 2 volumes containing not only Setsudo's account, but also prose and poetry on Tsukigase composed by more than 30 contributors, as well as 8 illustrations by the painter Miyazaki Seikoku. This book became a major hit. It was reprinted numerous times throughout the second half of the 19th, early 20th centuries. It was even reproduced in miniature formats and sold as a souvenir at Tsukigase. The book is small enough to fit in your hand or pocket so that you can carry it with you and recite the poems in it as you travel the site. From the 1830s onward, many painters and poets traveled to Tsukigase in early spring to capture its celebrated sites. The late Edo period painter Kanai Uju, for example, spent 2 full days sketching the scenery during his visit in 1832 before completing the set of 2 hand scrolls, searching for plums at Tsukigase. The meandering mountain roads disappear and reappear, enabling the viewer to move in and out of the treacherous landscape. Maps and prints also played a major role in popularizing this plum blossom valley. In fact, Seiko seems to have owned both a map and a print of Tsukigase. This map depicts area from northwest to southeast. It renders the landscape relatively flat, making it seem as though traveling on foot would not be too tiresome. In another print that Seiko owned, however, the site is portrayed as a deep mountainous valley dominated by towering cliffs and steep hillsides. Seiko most likely had these images as well as Setsudo's bestseller in mind when perceiving, remembering, and envisioning the valley. Seiko visited Tsukigase in 1878 during a 6-month trip to Western Japan, along with a few companions. Seiko's sketches of the site survive. Based on this experience and these sketches, Seiko produced this hand scroll, Plum Blossoms in Tsukigase Valley, in 1896, 16 years after visiting the site. The scroll was commissioned by Hasegawa Hisaie, one of Seiko's most important patrons. Seiko's scroll gives crystallized expression to the literati fascination with this site. So how does this scroll transform the physical place of Tsukigase into a paradisal site? And how does it make that paradise sensorially immersive for the viewer? Seiko uses a variety of pictorial and textual techniques to enliven the landscape. Specifically, Seiko draws on tropes from earlier utopian literature composed in China and widely known among Japanese literati. Seiko also adapts pictorial conventions associated with the depiction of immortal lands to infuse the landscape with an otherworldly aura. First, Seiko frames the painting with inscriptions that emphasize the difficulty of reaching the valley and the impossibility of reaching it while fully sober. Part of the postscript reads, "The lofty peaks are rugged and steep like cliffs, with perils everywhere. Enjoyment and hardship are in equal measure. No paradise is easily within reach. The very difficulty of attainment is precisely what makes a place a paradise." 19th century travelers who left accounts of their journeys to Tsukigase almost always emphasized the arduous travels they endured in order to reach their destination. Echoing this convention, Seiko's text stresses the trouble of toiling along the rugged mountain roads, implying that Tsukigase exists as a hard-to-reach haven. Further, a paradise cannot be reached when fully conscious. Paradises typically come into view only when one is lost or in a semi-conscious state of drunkenness or dreaming. Seiko notes in the postscript that while descending cliffs and ascending mountains, she could not resist the beckoning flags of taverns. Drinking to forget the arduousness of the journey, Seiko wandered freely in intoxication, unconscious of the distance she had traveled. This expression, unconscious of the distance one has traveled, appears in the opening lines of the record of the Peach Blossom Spring, composed by the Chinese poet Tao Yangming, who was active in the 4th and 5th centuries. The Peach Blossom Spring became one of the most influential works of utopian literature in East Asia. Numerous visualizations were made throughout history. This is a late 18th century rendition by the Japanese painter Watanabe Gentai. The story tells of a fisherman who follows a grove of blossoming peach trees lining both banks of a stream. At the source of the stream, he finds a small opening in the rocks. Crawling through, he discovers a hidden agrarian community cut off from the outside world for centuries. Men and women till the fertile land, while elders and children go about carefree. When leaving, the fisherman carefully marks the route, but no one manages to find the hidden community ever again. Importantly, the fisherman discovers the passage to the secluded land when he becomes unconscious of the distance he has traveled. Only by losing his way can the fisherman gain access to the utopia. According to the postscript, Seiko enters an altered state of consciousness through the aid of alcohol. Wandering freely and losing her way, Seiko follows the fragrant clouds of plum blossoms, just as the fisherman traced the blossoming peach trees lining each bank. The plum-filled valley of Tsukigase is thus presented as a utopia discovered by chance. Moreover, throughout the painted scroll, Seiko deploys motifs and modes of depiction specifically associated with immortal lands. For example, toward the beginning of the scroll, a lone pine tree hangs precariously from a cliff. Pines are long-lived evergreens that retain their needles through all the seasons. Because of their endurance and steadfastness, even in harsh winter weather, the pine has long been esteemed as an emblem of longevity in East Asia. Indeed, pines frequently populate immortal lands, as seen in this Chinese painting, Mountains of the Immortals. A red-robed immortal flies on the back of a crane in the sky, while large pine trees grow amidst green mountains and swirling clouds. Clinging to the cliff against an empty sky, this dramatically situated pine tree in Seiko's scroll might be seen as a spatial marker, demarcating the entrance to a land of immortals. As we unroll the scroll to proceed along our journey, we see white specks of plum blossoms giving rise to amorphous vapors that hover above the houses like bands of clouds. White clouds were also associated with the realms of immortals. In China, clouds were conceptualized as visible manifestations of cosmic energy, qi, as early as the first millennium BCE. Such energy, congealed in the form of clouds, could serve as vehicles for immortals to travel great distances, as can be seen in this Korean painting, which depicts a banquet hosted by the Queen Mother of the West, a goddess of immortality. A number of divine guests are ushered by clouds to descend from the sky to join the feast. Given the association between clouds and the realm of immortals, the blossom clouds in Seiko's painting seem to infuse the valley with a cosmic aura, turning the mountains into sacred peaks. These amorphous clouds might even function as a conveyance for the viewer, ferrying us into this mystic world. Following the meandering clouds, a dazzling riverscape begins to unfold before our eyes. Seiko employs bright mineral pigments, azurite blue and malachite green, to turn the valley into a gem-like paradise. Azurite and malachite are copper carbonate minerals. To make a pigment, the mineral is crushed and ground. Seiko uses azurite most conspicuously in the middle of the scroll, where radiant blue boulders arise alongside the river. Here, azurite is not applied flatly or uniformly. Rather, the washes of blue are painted in varying thickness so that the boulders gain a sense of three-dimensionality. They look as though they are glowing with supermundane luminosity. The use of azurite blue and malachite green in rendering mountains and rocks is thought to have begun in China during the early medieval period. Intriguingly, painting in mineral pigments came to be closely associated with the Taoist practice of alchemy. Elixirs of longevity and immortality were created from minerals, including some used as pigments. Moreover, immortal lands were sometimes imagined to be constructed of precious gemstones. As a result, the blue and green mode of landscape painting came to signal remote antiquity and distant Taoist paradises, evoking times long past or the unattainable realms of the immortals. By using this chromatic scheme, Seiko transforms Tsukigase into an otherworldly realm removed from the here and now. In unrolling the scroll and roaming through this lapidarian world, we are encouraged to cross into another time and space. However, the paradise thus constructed does not continue forever. It is carefully enclosed and protected. Toward the end of the scroll, a rocky outcropping erupts to cover our field of vision and block our leftward movement. Not only does this outcropping halt the viewer's journey, it also symbolically separates the preceding and succeeding spaces. There is, in fact, a stark contrast between what appears before and after this rocky barrier. Notably, the white plum blossoms that have profusely covered the landscape thus far disappear toward the end of the scroll. Moreover, the rich blue and green mineral pigments that had constructed a jewel-like world earlier gradually lose their intensity, fading away as the landscape dissolves into ethereality at the left edge. This rocky outcropping thus seems to signal the end of the paradisal realm. Demarcating the edge of Utopia, the outcrop separates and seals off the fantastical valley. Such protective natural barriers often appear in visualizations of peach blossom spring. For instance, in this 18th century Japanese rendition we saw earlier, the utopian community that unfolds on the flat plain in the middle ground is enclosed by the grotto wall of the foreground and the sheer cliffs of the background. The community is thus presented as a cloistered land, sheltered by topographic barriers. By including the motif of a protective enclosure, Seiko reinforces the connection between the real-world site of Tsukigase and paradisal realms, such as the peach blossom spring. Seiko's scrolls thus incorporates a number of literary and visual allusions to utopia, longevity, and immortality. Embodying these tropes, that Tsukigase envisioned in the scroll mediates between the natural valley and a mythical mountainscape. However, the paradise that's depicted is not a sight to be appreciated only visually. Rather, the scroll enables the viewer to become sensorially immersed in this real-world paradise. The key to sensing and feeling the paradise is to read the poems woven into the painting. In hand scrolls, texts are often inscribed on a separate sheet of paper or silk included before or after the paintings, so that the texts do not obstruct the images. But Seiko brushed lengthy text directly onto the painted hand scroll. As a result, image and text are able to interact closely in shaping the beholder's imagined experience of Tsukigase. The poems particularly evoke the sensory experiences of the wanderer who strolls, lodges, and drifts through the site. Thanks to the poems, fragrances, bodily sensations, and sounds, and more fill the scroll. Almost all of the 15 poems inscribed on the scroll evoke the fragrance of the plum blossoms suffusing the valley. The term fragrant world appears frequently throughout the inscriptions. The recurrence of the character fragrance seems to impart an aroma to the pictured landscape. In fact, Seiko writes that the scent of plum blossoms is so strong that it infuses the world completely. As the 8th poem evocatively describes, the sky is drunk on the pure fragrance, while the water is perfumed of itself. Plum blossoms are also likened to fragrant snow and fragrant clouds in the text. These are conventional terms used to describe plum blossoms in Semitic prose and poetry, but they correspond closely to Seiko's depictions of plum flowers cascading down the mountains like snow or hovering above the villages like clouds. Juxtaposing these images of nebulous blossoms with the characters for fragrant snow and fragrant clouds, the scroll encourages the viewer to imagine a sweet perfume wafting the world. The repeated evocation of fragrant snow further conveys the feeling of the cold air that permeates the valley in early spring. For instance, in the 5th poem, cool clouds embrace plum branches as the poetic subject rises early in the morning to admire the blossoms. But other poems suggest that spring is about to arrive in this deep mountain valley. For example, the 2nd poem indicates that the ice is melting and the river is surging with waves that resemble the patterns of silk brocade. Several poems also mention the east wind blowing through the valley to announce the arrival of spring. In the 13th poem, a gust of wind scatters the spring mists of blossoms. It is also a vernal breeze that creates a vision of the sacred mountain, Bofu, in the 8th poem. We beholders thus experience the unstable weather conditions of early spring as or along with the poetic subject, feeling both the cool air lingering in the mountains and an occasional gust of warm wind. This cool, fragrance vernal valley is also filled with sounds. In the first poem, the poetic subject greets an immortal who is chanting on a narrow path. The 15th poem in particular is full of sounds. At the edge of the forest, I suddenly hear the sound of flowing water. In the shade of the flowers, an early oriole sings so freely. Just then, a whistle, which gradually becomes distinct. Not even the finest dust obscures the tranquil sound. The sound of a whistle may be associated with transcendent being. Thus, not only does the blue and green landscape situate the viewer in a magical world, but also the sounds of immortals transport the beholder to a neverland. The viewer's experience of the sensory qualities of the luminous valley is facilitated by the numerous figures that populate the landscape throughout the scroll. These tiny wanderers encourage us viewers to sense and feel the pictured paradise as or with them. For example, as we follow the sharp turns of a zigzagging path, we encounter 3 figures in silhouette descending the road. They might be our fellow travelers, or they might act as our surrogates, helping us feel the arduous journey by foot. Traveling along the stream, we find a narrow waterfall flowing down the hillside to join the river below. 3 figures stand to watch the cascade as though to invite us to hear the sound of the gushing water alongside them. The liveliest scene in the scroll appears immediately past the waterfall. At the bottom, a boat carrying 2 passengers crosses the river. The boat is being pulled toward the foreground by a rope. 3 figures watch closely as this activity unfolds. In the middle ground, 3 figures climb a hill, while 2 figures sit in an open space, conversing or admiring the scenery. Not only does the presence of these tiny wanderers make the site appear inhabitable and traversable, but also it encourages us to join them in roaming and admiring the paradisal valley. Significantly, this hand scroll is not designed to be experienced only once. Rather, the scroll facilitates the viewer's continuous engagement with this paradise on earth. Toward the beginning, 2 small figures appear on the path. One stretches their right arm to point toward the left, seemingly directing the other figure's attention. Such a gesture also urges us viewers to continue exploring the landscape by unrolling the scroll. Toward the end of the scroll, 3 figures stand on the foreground bank. One extends their left arm to point toward the right, as though to guide the other figures. In pointing to the right, this figure might encourage us to travel backward through the site, that is, to view the scroll in the reverse direction from left to right. Alternatively, the figure's gesture might prompt us to restart our journey all over again from the beginning of the scroll, where we encounter again the figure pointing to the left to facilitate our leftward movement. By encouraging the viewer's continuous viewing and reading, the scroll does not present a unidirectional linear sequence. Instead, it generates a continuous loop, facilitating the viewer's prolonged bidirectional exploration of the painted paradise. Ironically, by the time Seiko created the hand scroll in 1896, Tsukigase was undergoing major transformations, becoming a much less vibrant paradise than it had been earlier in the 19th century. The importation of synthetic dyes in the Meiji era decreased the demand for safflower dyes. Consequently, the price of ubai, which has sustained the livelihood of villagers, plunged. Pressed to find alternative means of earning income, some villagers began to cut down plum trees for firewood, while others turned plum groves into tea plantations. Paradoxically, as the sight of plum blossoms was diminishing, the site began to receive more and more tourists. the construction of railroads and highways from the 1890s made it increasingly easier for urban residents to visit the mountain valley for recreation. Ultimately, fruiting plum groves for ubai would give way to flowering plum groves for tourists. Created at the time when Tsukigase was losing its earlier status as a secluded, untrodden haven, plum blossoms in Tsukigase Valley not only idealizes the site as a plum-filled paradise, but also enables the viewer to gain a sense of what it's like to roam through that paradise. Incorporating various elements of utopian literature and imagery, the work forever immerses us in the sights, sounds, and scents of a lost Neverland simply by unrolling the scroll. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much for your wonderful talk. I really feel like we've been immersed in sights and scents for the past 45 minutes. It almost feels like it should be February outside rather than early June. So we have a couple of questions already, but I thought we might just start with a kind of big, and I should remind everyone, please do enter any questions or comments you have into the Q&A box that should be at either the bottom or top of your screen. So first, could you just talk a little bit about how literati art became popular in Japan, particularly in the 19th century? What was so appealing about this art form? You're still muted.
I think there are three major factors that made literati art very popular in mid-19th century Japan. The first is the democratization of proficiencies in reading and composing Semitic poetry. Literati art is a combination of painting, poetry, and calligraphy. So we have to be able to read Chinese poems in order to fully engage with it. And literacy in Semitic poetry and prose was largely a prerogative of the male elite at the beginning of the Edo period in the 17th century, but that changes dramatically over the course of the Edo period. And by the early 19th century, an increasing portion of the population was able to read and write Semitic poetry. And that was because of the spread of private academies and also the expansion of print industry. So if you were living in a city in the late Edo period, you could go to a private academy to learn how to read and write, how to read Chinese classics. Even if you were living in a small village in the late Edo period, you could still educate yourself by reading printed books that were widely available for renting. And this trend of composing Semitic poetry continued into the Meiji period, when the social backgrounds of poets became more diversified and more women came to participate in poetry gatherings. So that's one reason why it became popular. The second reason might be that there were many officials of the Meiji government were also practitioners and collectors of literati art. So the revolutionary men who overthrew the Tokugawa shogunate and took offices in the Meiji administration had all received education in the Chinese classics. And at least for the educated elite in the 19th century Japan, classical Chinese was not necessarily a foreign language, but it was considered a language of serious writing, and a language, an effective means of expressing one's opinions about politics and society. And at the beginning of the Meiji period, these men came from various parts of Japan. They might have very different cultures and had different dialects, but they all shared this foundational education in the Chinese classics and their interest in composing Chinese poems. So this shared education and shared interest in classical Chinese helped them create horizontal bonds among themselves. That's the second factor. The last major factor that drove the boom of literati art might be the establishment of formal diplomatic relations between China and Japan. Japan did have relations with China in the Edo period through Nagasaki, but it was in 1871 when China and Japan established formal diplomatic relations. And that event facilitated both trade and travel between the two countries. The Japanese were now able to have access to various goods from China, like paintings, the recently excavated archaeological materials that were not widely available before. And Japanese intellectuals were able to also interact directly with Qing officials. They didn't, these Japanese poet officials didn't speak Chinese necessarily, but they could read and write Chinese, classical Chinese. So at the Qing embassy that was established in, Chinese embassy that was established in Tokyo in 1878, the Japanese poet officials flocked to, eager to communicate with Qing diplomats by writing in classical Chinese. So these three major factors may have created a boom of literati art in mid-19th century Japan.
Oh, amazing, thank you. So maybe you can talk a little bit more about Okuhara Seiko as well. How did someone like Seiko become like a literati art star in the 1860s and 70s?
Should we look at slides to see the popularity?
Sure. I think that would be great if you have some.
Yes. Let me share my screen again. So this is the, so there are many rankings that we can see to gauge the popularity of Seiko. So this is a ranking of artists, of painters and calligraphers from 1875. So you will see a ranking of calligraphers on the right and the ranking of painters on the left. And the figures that occupy the top register are the highest ranked artists. And Seiko's name really appears in the top left register. Seiko's name appears alongside other prominent male artists like Fukushima Ryuho, Haruki Nammei, or Shibata Zeshin. So this is one way in which we can see that. And it's interesting that Seiko's gender is not differentiated. Seiko is sharing a prominent place with other prominent male artists. But there are a few other rankings that place Seiko in the category of women painters. This is a ranking just published 2 years after, in 1877. And here Seiko's name appears in a category called Keishu, talented women, alongside other female artists like Nakabayashi Seishuku, Atomi Kake, or Noguchi Shohin. So it seems to imply that the women are at the lower register of the print, suggesting that the women were outside the category of great masters and artists. But what's interesting about this print is that Seiko is identified specifically as a specialist of ink painting, bokuga, while other artists, women artists, are identified as landscape specialists, specialists of figures, or let's see.
So, but what made Seiko so popular? How did Seiko end up being placed in the top ranking of painters at the time?
I think there are many possible reasons, but one of them might be that Seiko was very well educated. Seiko came from a family of high-ranking retainer in the Koga domain. Seiko studied Chinese classics under the Confucian scholar in the clan. She also received education in Chinese-style literati painting and calligraphy by an artist in the Koga domain. And Seiko was also well connected to the politicians, practitioners of literati art. So after arriving in Edo, Seiko came to be well connected to major political figures, especially Kido Takayoshi. Seiko seems to have known Kido Takayoshi first. Kido was one of the architects of the Meiji oligarchy, who was also very, very well known as a collector and calligrapher. And then through Kido, Seiko seems to have known many other political figures who were patrons of literati art. And Seiko's name appears often in Kido's diary. in which they're almost always having a party, drunkenly painting and writing. And these parties might have allowed Seiko to expand a network of contacts with other potential patrons or other potential collaborative artists to collaborate.
That actually connects to one of the questions that just was posed in the Q&A. So were artists like Seiko, did they have any interest in tea, or did they do chado, or like, can you, what was the role of tea culture in literati art?
Definitely. Seiko was very involved in tea, Seiko and her peers. Seiko specifically, so Seiko and Seiko's peers were interested in Chinese style steeped tea. And Seiko was actually a member of a tea group, Han Kansha. And they met regularly and had some meals together, and tea was incorporated into that practice. Seiko and Seiko's friends also made tea implements, Chinese style tea implements.
Oh, wow.
One of them is a Chinese teapot that was collaboratively made. It's in the Kumagaya City Library, but it's a tiny teapot, and there it has paintings and calligraphic inscriptions by several artists, and Seiko paints orchids on the lid.
Oh.
So they were deeply engaged in Chinese style steeped tea. And steeped tea is very interesting in that it also became a space for public exhibition.
Oh, wow.
That's one of the most important arenas where artists like Seiko could see recently imported Chinese Ming and Qing paintings and calligraphy.
So the tea world kind of provided another means of networking, somewhat similar to what Seiko was engaged with politicians, right?
I think
and some
so,
of
yes.
the politicians were tea practitioners as well, right?
That's right. Kido was especially was interested in tea, and he was deeply he in his diary too. He writes about how he displayed objects in a tea setting.
Great.
And there are many records of tea gatherings, which also provides an inventory of objects that were displayed. And there are sometimes illustrated, and these artists also illustrated these books. And so you can see what kinds of objects were displayed and how these objects were arranged. There are also Chinese musical instruments that were displayed alongside these key objects. And sometimes music was played, Chinese music was played in the garden while this exhibition was happening. So it was a very immersive environment.
Oh. So this also connects to another question that was just posed. Do you have a sense of how women, particularly literati women, were accepted or not by male literati at this time? It sounds like Seiko was quite well integrated into lots of different networks, but can you speak any more generally about that?
Seiko seems to have been deeply integrated into the community of literati artists and patrons. You can see that in Kido's diary, you can see that in the rankings. You can also see some in collaborative works that they did. I can show you another. So here is collaborative painting. So Seiko lived in the Shitaya community in Tokyo. That was a hub for literati artists. There were calligraphers, poets, and Confucian scholars living near Seiko's residence. So there was a community of literati artists in that neighborhood. And Seiko frequently met with them, exchanged ideas, learned poetry from one of the major poetry figures. And also they made collaborative works like this. This is a hanging scroll that Seiko made collaboratively with 4 other artists. So Fukushima Ryuho did this, let's see, Hattori Hazan did this, painted this rock. Fukushima Ryuho painted roses on a pot. Takikate added this orchids. Matsuoka Kansei painted lotus flowers in a vase, and then Seiko added this extensive set of Chinese style stationery. And what's interesting about this particular, there are many collaborative works like this that seem to testify the friendship that Seiko enjoyed with other male artists. And what's interesting about this particular work is that it's written, it implies that Seiko, this particular gathering was held at Seiko's studio.
Oh, amazing.
So Seiko might have been the host of these gatherings as well. And it was not just Seiko who was integrated in this male circle of friends. There's also Noguchi Shohin, who was a major literary figure, and her name also appears in Kito's diary and sencha, get records of sencha gatherings. So women are not necessarily excluded from literary gatherings or communities.
Great, thank you. So maybe we can talk a little bit more about the hand scroll itself. There are several questions about it. First is, you talked about many different senses, sight, smells, and sounds. Do they ever talk about taste in the scroll? Do they talk about the taste of the plums themselves, or do they talk about the fruits forming from the blossoms or anything like that?
I don't think that poems necessarily talk about taste, except that they mentioned that Seiko was drinking, was drunk. But there are other poems on plums, Chinese and Japanese poems on plum, flowering plum, that mention the taste of plum flowers. Poets, for the subject eating blossoms, and then reciting poems, like reciting fragrant poems by chewing on the blossoms.
Wow.
So Seiko could be, might have known this, subcategory of plum poetry on eating plum blossoms. It could have been thinking about that. But I don't think they necessarily directly mention the taste of the paradise in this particular scroll.
And then further regarding plums, as you talked about, in the Chinese tradition, there's probably more of an emphasis on peach blossoms as a signifier of paradise. Did plum itself have some kind of utopian connotation in China or in earlier Japanese works, or do you think plum as paradise is a kind of Meiji or Wakamatsu Meiji interpretation?
That's a very good question. Can you think of plum paradise in China?
In China, I can't really think of plum paradise other than Mount Luofu in southern China in Guangdong, where supposedly during the Sui dynasty in the 6th century, a scholar got drunk, fell asleep in a plum grove and dreamt of a beautiful woman, and then he woke up the next day and realized that the woman he had seen was the spirit of the plum blossoms. But I don't know if I can think of examples where plum itself is somehow a signifier of paradise. And in gardens, the reference is always made to the peach blossom spring story. So it's the peach that is somehow supposed to connote paradise. Plum, it seems, is much more associated with hermits, and you've discussed plum much more extensively than I have, but it seems like it's not necessarily paradise so much as it is eremitism and reclusion or something.
Yeah, that's true. The connection might be important, right? The association of plum with reclusion, idea of reclusion, was probably important for Seiko and Seiko's peers in experiencing Tsukigase.
So there's also a comment, the same person who asked about the association of peach and plum in paradise says that she was thinking that Suehiro Techo's Setsubai might have something to do with it. Do you know?
No, I'd love to learn more.
Great. And then there's a question also about Tsukigase as a plum blossom destination is kind of reminiscent of Mount Yoshino and cherry blossoms. So do you know if Waka poets were interested in Tsukigase, or was it really just a Sinitic literati site?
Yeah, I think there were Waka poets who were interested in the site, and there are some Waka poems composed on Tsukigase. And it's not that literary artists were only interested in Tsukigase. Seiko actually mentions Yoshino in the inscriptions. So it's like a plum version of Yoshino. Tsukigase is like a plum version of Yoshino. Yoshino was famous for cherry blossoms. And Seiko also painted Arashiyama, which was famous for cherries as well. And the Sumida River, which was also known for cherry blossoms.
And so maybe just one final, it's actually both a comment and a question. So one person says, "This is so brilliant and inspiring with phenomenal breadth and depth. Has Dr. Wakamatsu written or published a book one can order?"
That's very kind. Thank you so much. I haven't written a book yet, but I do have an article. If you're interested, email, I'll send you my article. It's actually, it's actually about plums. This is about Okura Seiko's later painting, Hanging Straw, from 1907, and the top of the scroll has a beautiful woman with plum blossoms above, and there's a long inscription. So I'll be happy to send you an article. I'll send you a copy of my article if you're interested. Thank you.
And where can people find your email address?
If you just Google me in Occidental College, it's just Wakamatsu at oxy.edu.
Great. Well, thank you so much for your wonderful talk and this exciting Q&A. And thank you everyone for joining us. So as I said, this is the last lecture of our spring 2021 lecture series, and we'll resume again in the fall in September with some lectures on calligraphy that accompany the new exhibition in the Chinese Garden Gallery. So thank you everyone for joining us, and please join me again in thanking Dr. Wakamatsu for her amazing lecture.